are you really going to build a forensics lab for yourself? Do you have a spare $100,000 minimum buy-in? Probably more like $250,000. I mean, that's really what this comes down to, right? Well, there's two reasons to know about the forensics lab and how to build one, what the components are. One, because you got to know it for the test. And two, because when you first get into this and you look at somebody else's forensics lab, you need to know what to expect when you get there, what facilities should be there. You need to know also, if you're the junior tech, that these things exist. So be ready to know and be familiar with your surroundings. So that's why we talk about forensics labs. Now we're going to break it down into components of the forensics lab. We're going to talk about the computers, the physical location, the basic hardware for that physical location, and the software that you should be encountering on a regular basis. Now, you should be able to describe the needs of a forensics investigator from an office equipment and tools standpoint. You should be able to know what your physical needs in that lab are. Now, it may be as simple as office equipment, the office itself, the tools. Here's a perfect example of people not thinking about a forensics lab when they say, oh, well, we'll put that over in the corner of the building. We'll give you a nice window in the forensics lab. No. Forensics labs don't have windows. So we'd rather be in the center of the building. So that simple little thing of what we should expect, what we shouldn't expect, really needs to be adjusted for. You say, well, Dean, who cares if we have a window in there or not? Well, if you want to have a certified forensics lab in the future to process other people's, other organizations' information, you're going to have to get your physical lab certified by a third party. So we need to know about the certified third parties also. Here we go. American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, Laboratory Accrediting Board. Now, when we look at what they're discussing there in the Laboratory Accrediting Board, they're talking about all crime scene evidence. They're talking about DNA testing. They're talking about fingerprint databases. They're talking about all of those things. We're going to narrow our scope down to what's important as a computer cybercrime lab, if you will. Now, this is a voluntary certification, but I think that if you're actually going to be in this business, that you may want to apply for that certification. And this, by the way, this lab, these requirements can work for any size lab at all. If you look at the compliance standard, you can see at least 102 different elements in the set. We're not going to go over 102 of them. We're going to go over some of those so that you know the formal language that they're talking about and the ones that are really germane to the forensics investigator topic for the EC Council certification. Okay, so generally, what does this lab certification say? It says, well, you can demonstrate things like management, operation, personnel procedures, equipment, all of that stuff that you have in your lab meets a national and international standard level of service or level of capability. Remember when we talked at the very beginning about how forensics from a cybercrime standpoint is kind of new and that there's a whole bunch of different certifications out there and we don't know which ones are going to be the ones that are going to eventually lead? Well, the same thing applies to labs that are out there. Even since 1982, things have changed. And so we need to be prepared in our lab to meet or exceed those expectations. Because there is going to come a day, just like attorneys passing the bar exam or CPAs passing the CPA's exam, there's going to be a time where the requirement is going to be international. They're going to create an ISO standard for it, And if you're not ISO certified for your lab, or your certification that you take isn't ISO certified, then you're not going to be a player in the market. You're not going to have a job. So if you're aware of these things, then you're in a better space. Okay, let's take a look, a sample of the standards. We're just going to look at like 4 or 5 here, just real quick. First off, a training program for computer forensics. So the essential topics in computer forensics. By the way, in a little while, we're going to go over the essential topics that are there. I've taken the outline from these courses outside of the EC Council and put them into one unit that you'll see in a little while. New procedures must be validated and proven for their efficacy. In other words, do these things work? Remember we talked about having the computer lab over here of operating systems to test out these things? We need to do the same thing with the physicality of our organization so that when we're actually pulling data or taking pictures, that those pictures are consistent and reliable. They need to be scientifically proven. Controls and standard samples must be used and documented in the case record to ensure the validity of the testing parameters and thereby the conclusion. So what controls and standards are being used when you're creating your forensics image? Usually what you'll say when you're creating a forensics image is, we use all NIST approved software tools. We use hardware tools that have been approved in these jurisdictions as passing the minimum evidence requirements. So those are kind of your bright lines there. You go and you look at, well, you may not do it, but somebody goes and looks at case law, and in the case law, in the court proceedings, they'll say they use this kind of equipment. And in using that kind of equipment, when it was challenged by the opposing counsel, it was found to be consistent and true. That's what it's always about. It's not about that you have the perfect tool. It's about when you presented that tool, it was challenged by the opposing counsel, that it actually succeeded and won and met the challenge, as it were. Instruments and equipment should be adequate for the procedures used. That's a pretty vague thing. But think about it. If you're processing 1 case a month, you only really need 1 computer with 4 or 5 hard drives on it. But if you're processing 100 cases a week, you're going to need an entirely different tool set. So it needs to be accurate for the flow. Now, what you've done all along, every time you have a case that is processed by your lab, you're recording that case that's been processed, what kind of equipment you used, what kind of equipment you encountered, what kind of evidence you actually processed. Not necessarily the case number or anything like that that you're exposing externally, but saying, okay, we've worked on 60 Nokia phone cases, we've worked on 32 Apple iPhone cases, we worked blah, 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 blah. You know, you create all that rich data and you say, this is how much we're processing and these are the tools that we use to process it. You need to be able to defend that that particular storage area network is valid for your purposes. All the equipment that you have has to be in proper working order. What's proper working order? Well, that it actually produces results. And by the way, if it's broken and you can't get your job done, that's going to stop all the forensics in your particular lab. Now, last 2 things here. Instruments and equipment must be properly calibrated, tuned to the environment. What are the calibration standards? Again, especially for software, they actually have calibration testing software that you use. So if you upgrade to the next version of your tool, you might want to go back to the NIST standard and say, has this tool been processed? Has this tool processed this calibration data and found to be correct? If you're rolling out a new version of the tool and it hasn't been calibrated yet, you might not want to adopt that inside of your lab. Last, competency test. What does a competency test consist of? If I was doing criminal investigations, I would think that CCE is probably the one that you would want, and that's only available for law enforcement at this point. It may be opened up to a larger audience. But if it's not CCE, it's any one of the others that is on the list that we talked about at the very beginning. I think the Certified Forensics Examiner, I think the EC Council is sufficient as a starting certification, but you need certifications for the particular tools you're going to work in and for the particular operating systems that you work on. So I think it would be a really good idea is if you're going to be a forensics examiner for Microsoft operating systems, that you have something like the MCSE, or you have something that that says you're an expert in the Microsoft operating systems. If you're going to do phone forensics, you work with the phone forensics tools and software, and that you've proven that, not just getting a certificate, but some sort of certification that says, hey, I've got this experience. It will go toward your value as an investigator. It will also go toward your presence in the courtroom when you're being validated as an expert witness. So it helps support you as you go along. So that's the sample standards, and next we're going to dig down deep into the lab and all of the equipment that we're going to talk about there in the lab.